All right, deep divers, welcome back. Today, we're going deep on something that's like ripped straight from a UPSC exam, but it's also a huge deal in the real world, especially for India.
Absolutely.
We're talking about Pakistan,
Mhm.
kind of walking a tightrope, trying to keep
Yeah,
China happy while the West is turning up the heat.
right.
And the thing that ties it all together,
CPEC.
the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. We've got a whole bunch of sources for this one, news analysis, what the experts are saying, even some official statements from Pakistan. You ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
Okay, so CPEC, for those who might not have all the details memorized, what's the deal with it? What is it?
So CPEC, it's basically this massive infrastructure project. It connects China all the way to Gwadar Port in Pakistan. That's on the Arabian Sea.
Okay,
We're talking roads, railways, pipelines, power plants. It's a multi-billion-dollar investment, all from China.
wow. So on the surface, it seems like a pretty good deal for Pakistan.
Yeah, the idea is to boost Pakistan's economy and make it easier to connect different parts of the region.
Right, makes sense. So why is the West making such a fuss about it?
Well, the West, especially the U.S., they see it a little differently, more like a power play by China.
A power play.
Yeah, they think China's trying to flex its muscles in the region, maybe even challenge U.S. interests.
Oh, interesting.
And then there are concerns about, how transparent these deals really are,
Right.
whether Pakistan can handle all the debt, and even the environmental impact of all these projects.
So it's not as simple as it seems on the surface,
Definitely not.
and it sounds like Pakistan's starting to feel the squeeze. We've seen some recent developments. The World Bank canceled a loan. A UK envoy issued a warning about power purchase agreements. And even the U.S. has imposed sanctions on some Pakistani entities.
Yeah, those are some pretty clear signals.
So what's the story with the World Bank?
Okay, so the World Bank was going to give Pakistan this $500 million loan, right?
To help with their energy sector.
Exactly. But they pulled back. Officially, it's because Pakistan didn't revise their power purchase agreements.
Specifically, the ones with Chinese independent power producers, the IPPs.
Right, those are the private companies that build and run power plants.
Right. Okay, so the World Bank's basically saying, get your act together before we give you more money.
Pretty much. They're worried about the prices and the terms of those agreements with the Chinese IPPs. They think it could put Pakistan in a tough spot financially down the line.
So it's not just geopolitics at play here. There are genuine economic concerns.
Well, sure.
And what about the UK's warning? What was that all about?
The UK's envoy to Pakistan urged them to be more transparent when they're negotiating with IPPs. They didn't specifically say Chinese companies, but it's pretty obvious who they're talking about.
Right, reading between the lines.
Exactly. It's like they're saying, hey, be careful with these deals. Make sure they're really in Pakistan's best interest.
Sounds like Pakistan's in a tough spot. They need the investment, but they also don't want to upset their partners in the West. So how are they responding to all this pressure?
Well, on one hand, they're downplaying the idea that the West is coordinating this pressure.
Trying to project an image of strength.
Yeah, like they're in control.
Okay.
They keep saying that CPEC is absolutely vital for Pakistan's development, and it's all in line with their own interests.
Right, makes sense.
There's even a quote from someone on Pakistan's CPEC team. They were saying that back when they started this project, they desperately needed investment, and China was the only one who stepped up.
So a friend in need, but now those friendships are getting a little complicated.
Yeah, a bit.
What else is Pakistan saying to defend CPEC?
Pakistan's federal minister, Ahsan Iqbal, he's the one in charge of CPEC, he's been pretty vocal.
Okay.
He's emphasizing how transparent the project is, how it's going to bring economic growth and stability to the whole region, and how China and Pakistan are constantly talking to make sure it benefits both of them.
It seems like they're trying to reassure everyone, including China, that they're not backing down. But I imagine there's also pressure from within Pakistan.
Absolutely. Pakistani businesses, especially those that rely on Western technology or export to the West, they're worried.
About what could happen if things go sour with the West.
Exactly. They understand that economic stability is important, but they're also nervous about becoming too reliant on China.
So Pakistan's walking a tightrope here,
Definitely.
trying to keep everyone happy.
Yeah.
But what I find really interesting, especially from an Indian perspective, is how CPEC plays into all of this. How's India viewing these developments?
That's where things get really interesting, especially for our UPSC folks out there.
Yeah.
Don't forget, CPEC goes through territory that India claims, so it adds a whole other layer of complexity.
Right, of course.
India has been very clear that they oppose CPEC. They see it as a violation of their sovereignty and a potential threat. They're worried that CPEC will make China stronger in the region and undermine India's own interests.
So it's not just a two-way issue between Pakistan and China. It has big implications for the whole region,
Absolutely.
and it's something India is watching very closely.
For sure. It's a real-world example of how domestic politics, economics, and international relations all come together. And it highlights the challenges India faces as it tries to navigate this really complex and rapidly changing geopolitical landscape.
This is where things get really interesting for our deep dive. Let's dig into those challenges and explore India's potential responses in the next part.
So, India, they're in a tricky spot. Watching Pakistan do this balancing act, how does India, with its own goals and concerns, deal with the situation where their neighbor is getting closer to China?
Yeah, it's a tough one, especially with all the history between India and Pakistan. So for our listeners who are thinking about the UPSC exam, what are some of the options India has?
Well, there are a few ways to look at it. Realists, they'd probably say India needs to focus on getting more powerful in the region, to counter China, like beefing up their military, making strategic alliances, maybe even investing in their own infrastructure projects to compete with CPEC.
So basically, if you build a road, we'll build a bigger, better road. But wouldn't that just make things more tense in the region?
It could. That's why the liberal institutionalists, they'd probably suggest something different. More like working with Pakistan and China through organizations like SAARC or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
It's more of a diplomatic, team player kind of approach.
Exactly. The idea is to build trust, work together, maybe even find some common ground on things like trade and connectivity.
That sounds good, but is it realistic?
Yeah.
I mean, India and Pakistan, they have a lot of baggage, a lot of mistrust.
It's definitely a challenge, no doubt, but not impossible. Remember, even with all the tension, India and Pakistan have worked together in the past, like with disaster relief efforts.
Right, right.
And maybe CPEC, because it creates new economic opportunities, it could actually open some doors for more practical cooperation.
Okay, so baby steps towards a better relationship. That's something our UPSC folks could definitely analyze. But what about India's worries about how CPEC affects their own interests?
That's a big one for India. One of their biggest concerns is that CPEC strengthens China's presence in the region, kind of encircling India, both geographically and economically.
I see, yeah.
Think about it. A stronger Chinese presence in the Arabian Sea because of Gwadar Port, that could be a problem for India's maritime security.
That's a good point. It's not just about the land route, but also about giving China access to the sea. So what can India do about it? Just watch and wait. Try to mess with CPEC. Offer something else.
Those are all options, and India's strategy is probably going to be a mix of things. We're already seeing them invest a lot in infrastructure, especially near their borders and in countries like Iran, which gives them another way to reach Central Asia. It's a way to counter China's influence.
Okay.
India is also strengthening their relationships with other countries in the region. They're looking for partners who can help balance out China's growing power.
So it's a multi-pronged strategy. A bit of realism, a bit of liberalism, but there's also the economic side of things. How does India protect its own economic interests with all these changes CPEC is bringing to the region?
That's a crucial part of the puzzle. India has been pushing its own regional connectivity projects, like the International North-South Transport Corridor. That one aims to connect India with Central Asia and Russia, completely bypassing Pakistan.
So creating new trade routes that don't involve Pakistan or China.
Exactly. It's about having more options and making sure India isn't left out as things change in the region. But it's not just about countering CPEC, it's also about taking advantage of the potential benefits that come with regional integration.
Now this is where things get really interesting. Could India actually benefit from CPEC, even though they have concerns about it?
That's a question worth thinking about. Officially, India is against CPEC. But some experts say there might be areas where limited engagement could benefit both countries. Well, imagine if CPEC leads to big improvements in infrastructure and connectivity. Could Indian businesses benefit from that, maybe through trade or investment? Could it open up new markets for Indian goods and services? These are the kind of things Indian policymakers have to think about.
It's a tough call. On one side, you have strategic worries and a lot of mistrust. On the other side, there are potential economic opportunities and maybe, just maybe, a chance for better cooperation in the region.
Exactly. It's complicated, and there are no easy answers. For our listeners, especially those preparing for the UPSC, this is the kind of situation that requires careful analysis, strategic thinking, and a deep understanding of what's going on both inside and outside of India.
This is exactly the kind of deep dive we aim for. So what should our listeners, especially those interested in diplomacy and foreign policy, be looking out for in the coming months?
Keep an eye on a few things. First, how will Pakistan manage this balancing act between China and the West? Will they change things about CPEC to make the West happy, or will they just get closer to China?
That's a big one. And what about India? What are they going to do to address their concerns and protect their interests?
Watch what they do diplomatically in the region, how they invest in infrastructure, and their stance on these regional connectivity projects. Will they stay confrontational about CPEC, or will they try to find ways to engage, even a little bit?
And of course, we have to keep an eye on the bigger picture. What happens with the U.S. and China? How will that affect the region?
Absolutely. Things are changing all the time. It's complex. There are no simple answers. But if we stay informed and understand what's driving all of this, we can navigate these uncertain times better.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about something we haven't touched on much yet, the human element.
That's a good point. It's easy to get lost in all the geopolitics and forget that real people are affected by all of this.
Exactly. What are the social and economic consequences of CPEC for the people who live in the region? Are their lives better because of this project, or are they paying the price?
It's a complicated question, and it depends on who you ask. Some people say that CPEC is bringing much-needed investment and development, creating jobs, improving infrastructure.
So it could be a good thing for local communities?
It could, but others are worried about the environment, about people being displaced from their homes, and about Pakistan becoming too dependent on China, maybe even going deeper into debt.
So there are downsides too. What about from India's point of view? Are there any concerns about how this affects people that India needs to think about as they develop their strategy?
Absolutely. A key concern is how CPEC might impact the people living in the parts of Kashmir that are currently under Pakistani control. There are worries about land being taken away, environmental damage, and even the potential loss of local cultures and identities. India has to be very careful about how their response to CPEC might affect these communities. They need to make sure those voices are heard.
That's a really important point. We have to remember that behind all the headlines and political maneuvering, there are real people whose lives are being shaped by these events.
Exactly. And understanding their stories can give us a much deeper and more nuanced understanding of the world around us.
All right, that's a great place to pause for this segment of our deep dive. We've really unpacked the complexities of CPEC, looked at India's potential responses, and even delved into the human stories that are often overlooked in these big geopolitical discussions. But we still have more to explore, right?
We do. In the next part, we're going to look at some potential future scenarios. How might all these interests and strategies play out?
This is turning out to be a truly fascinating deep dive, and I know our listeners are eager to hear what the future holds. So stay tuned for the final part of this episode, where we'll look ahead at the potential impact of CPEC on the region and beyond. And if you're finding this deep dive valuable, don't forget to like and subscribe for more insightful analyses of current affairs. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into CPEC and what it means for India. We've covered a lot of ground, the current situation, what the different players are thinking, and even how this massive project is affecting people's lives. Now let's try to look into the future. What are some possible scenarios that could play out, and how would they affect the region, especially India?
Well, predicting the future is never easy, but we can use what we know about the situation to map out some potential paths. Let's start with a scenario where CPEC keeps moving forward as planned, with China and Pakistan getting even closer and finishing all those infrastructure projects.
Okay, so full steam ahead. What would that look like for Pakistan? And how would the West react?
In this scenario, Pakistan would probably see a lot of economic growth, at least in the short term, maybe even the medium term. Better infrastructure could boost their trade, bring in foreign investment, create jobs. But whether that economic growth lasts in the long run, that depends on a few things, like what kind of loans they're getting from China, how well they manage the projects, and whether they can actually make money from them.
And the West? Do they just sit back and watch as China's influence grows?
I doubt it. The West, especially the U.S., they'd probably keep putting pressure on Pakistan, maybe through sanctions, trying to isolate them diplomatically, or even supporting groups that oppose the government. They might also try to counter China's influence by strengthening their own alliances in the region, maybe even offering alternative development projects.
So it'd be like a tug of war, with Pakistan stuck in the middle. But what about India? Where do they fit into this?
India's response would depend on a few things. How much of a threat do they think CPEC is? What are their own economic and strategic goals? And how are things changing in the region? They could take a more aggressive approach, trying to disrupt CPEC or counter China's influence with their own initiatives.
That sounds like it could escalate things, maybe even lead to conflict. Are there any options that aren't so confrontational?
Of course, India could focus on strengthening their own position economically and strategically, maybe by getting closer to countries like the US, Japan, and Australia, or by investing in connectivity projects that go around Pakistan. They could also try to find areas where they can work with China and Pakistan on things like trade or water management.
So being more practical, protecting their own interests, but also recognizing that the situation is changing. But what if things don't go so smoothly with CPEC? What if it runs into problems, maybe even stalls or fails to deliver what it promised?
Yeah, that's a possibility. It could happen for a few reasons. Political instability in Pakistan, economic mismanagement, security threats, maybe even a breakdown in the relationship between China and Pakistan. If that happens, Pakistan could face some serious economic problems, and that could lead to social unrest and political instability.
That doesn't sound good for Pakistan. But what would it mean for India?
It's hard to say for sure. On one hand, India might see it as a chance to regain some strategic ground, maybe even have more influence in Pakistan. But on the other hand, a Pakistan that's in trouble could create new problems for India. Things like cross-border terrorism, refugees, and instability in the region.
So it could be an opportunity for India, but it could also be a risk. It seems like there are no easy answers in this situation.
Exactly. That's what makes it so fascinating for anyone interested in international relations and geopolitics. It shows how domestic politics, economic development, and strategic competition are all connected. And it highlights how important it is to think strategically, to use diplomacy, and to really understand the complexities of the region.
I'm sure our UPSC listeners are taking notes. This is the kind of real-world scenario they could face in their careers.
Absolutely. And it's not just for future diplomats. Anyone who wants to understand India's place in the world and the challenges it faces, they can learn a lot from studying this situation.
Well said. So as we wrap up our deep dive, what are the key takeaways for our listeners? What should they be paying attention to as this story unfolds?
A few things to keep in mind. First, CPEC is more than just an infrastructure project. It's a sign of China's growing ambitions on the world stage and its competition with the US. Second, Pakistan is walking a fine line, trying to meet its economic needs without damaging its diplomatic relationships. Third, India has a lot at stake here, and their response will have a big impact on the region. And finally, this is a fluid situation. Things are changing all the time, so stay informed and keep asking those tough questions.
Great advice. And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of CPEC, its implications for India, and the broader geopolitical landscape. Be sure to like and subscribe for more insightful analyses of current affairs. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep thinking critically.